In the vast, silent desert of the West, a single act of kindness can echo louder than a gunshot, changing the course of a river and the destiny of a man. The 1882 Sunday beat down on the Lone Pine Ranch, baking the very soul of the land. Elijah Stone, a man whose face was a map of hard years, watched his daughter Ilara draw water from the well. Her movements were graceful, a stark contrast to the harsh landscape. It was she who saw it first. A gasp, sharp and sudden. He followed her wide-eyed gaze to a dark crimson trail staining the dust, leading directly to the stones of their well. Fear, cold and immediate, gripped Elijah. In these lands, blood meant trouble, and trouble was a guest that always overstayed its welcome. He reached for the rifle resting against the porch rail, his knuckles white as he took in the scene before him. Behind the well, slumped against the cool stone, was a young Blackfoot warrior. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, a dark stain spreading across his deerskin shirt. One hand was outstretched, fingers straining for the promise of water. Elijah's aim was steady, his mind a whirlwind of warnings. Harboring a native was a death sentence, an invitation for a noose. But then he saw the man's eyes, unfocused yet filled with a desperate, universal thirst. It was the same thirst he remembered from the great drought, a fire in the throat that burned away all differences between men, leaving only the raw need to live. Ilara stood frozen, her bucket forgotten, her heart pounding against her ribs. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah lowered the barrel of his rifle. The warrior's gaze flickered, a spark of awareness in the depths of his pain. "Water," Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible. She took the ladle from her bucket, her hand trembling as she scooped the clear, cold liquid. She moved forward, ignoring her father's silent caution. She knelt beside the wounded man, holding the ladle to his lips. He drank with a desperation that was painful to watch, the water spilling down his chin. As he drank, Elijah noted the clean, round hole in his shirt. It was from a firearm, recent and likely fired by someone who was still searching for their target. The act of mercy had been given, but the danger had just begun. The warrior, having drunk his fill, slumped back. His eyes, now clearer, settled on Ilara. A silent gratitude passed between them, a moment of connection that transcended words. He then looked at Elijah, his expression unreadable. "My name is Elijah Stone," the rancher said, his voice gruff. "And this is my daughter, Ilara." The warrior inclined his head slightly. "Tano," he breathed, the name a soft exhale. He tried to rise to show he was no threat, but a wave of pain forced him back down. Ilara quickly tore a strip from her apron. "You must let me see to that wound," she insisted gently. "It needs cleaning." This was no longer just about giving water. It was about saving a life. Ilara worked with a focused calm, cleaning Tano's wound with a poultice of yarrow and crushed herbs her mother had taught her to use. It was a simple remedy, but effective. Tano bore the sting without a sound, his gaze fixed on her face. Just as she began to bandage the injury, a faint, rhythmic sound drifted on the wind. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, but many, riding hard. Elijah's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Inside, both of you," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Quickly." Tano's body tensed, a primal fear flashing in his eyes. He knew that sound. He knew who it heralded. The thunder of approaching doom grew louder, a drumbeat counting down their final seconds of peace. They helped Tano into the small, dim cabin. He leaned heavily against Elijah, his strength failing him. "The blood," Ilara whispered, her face pale. "The trail to the well." Elijah cursed under his breath. He grabbed a bucket and began scrubbing at the stained earth, but it was a futile effort. The dry ground had drunk the crimson evidence, leaving a dark, accusing path. There was no time. The riders were cresting the nearby hill, 6 dark figures silhouetted against the unforgiving sky. They moved like a storm cloud, a promise of violent retribution. Tano, watching from the crack in the door, grabbed Elijah's wrist. His eyes held a knowing look. A silent message. It is too late to hide. At the head of the riders was Marshal Silas Kane, a man whose reputation was as grim as the set of his jaw. His face was a mask of cruel authority, his eyes missing any hint of compassion. He was known for collecting bounties and scalps with equal enthusiasm, a lawman who saw the world in black and white, with no room for mercy. He reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping across the small ranch, immediately locking onto the disturbed, damp earth near the well. "Stone!" he bellowed, his voice like grinding gravel. "Show yourself! We are hunting for a murdering savage, and his trail ends right at your feet." His hand rested casually on the handle of his revolver, a silent, deadly threat. Elijah stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He positioned himself in front of the door, a silent guardian. "Just drawing water, Marshal," he said, his tone even. "The ground is wet from a spilled bucket." Kane's lips curled into a sneer. He did not believe a word of it. "Is that so?" he drawled, dismounting. "I have tracked a wounded heathen for 10 miles. He is here. Give him up, and I might forget to burn this place down around you." His men spread out, their firearms drawn, their faces hard and unforgiving. The air grew thick with tension, a single spark away from erupting into violence. Ilara watched from inside, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a cry. Marshal Kane took a menacing step toward the cabin, his eyes fixed on the door as if he could see through the wood. "I will not ask again, old man. Harboring a fugitive, especially a native, is a hanging offense. Do you want your daughter to see you swing?" The threat hung in the air, vile and potent. Elijah stood his ground, his face an unreadable mask of resolve. He would not sacrifice one life to save his own. The standoff stretched, the silence broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses. Kane smiled, a predator toying with its prey. He gestured to 2 of his men. "Check the barn. The rest of you, with me." He started toward the porch, his intent clear. He would tear the house apart if he had to. Just as Kane's boot touched the first step of the porch, the cabin door opened. Tano stood there, leaning against the frame for support. He was weakened, but his posture was proud, defiant. Kane's smile widened. "Well, well. Look what we have here." The cornered animal comes out of its den. He raised his firearm, pointing it directly at Tano's heart. "Your murdering days are over, savage." But then, something impossible happened. Tano spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried a strange power. The words were in his native tongue, a language as old as the mountains themselves, flowing like a calm but powerful river. The effect on Marshal Kane was immediate and shocking. Kane froze mid-step, his firearm wavering. The color drained from his face, leaving it a ghostly white. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated disbelief. His hand fell away from his weapon, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came out. He recognized something in those ancient words, something that shattered his confidence and filled him with a sudden, chilling dread. His men looked on, confused by their leader's bizarre reaction. They saw only a wounded native, a cornered fugitive. But Kane saw something else entirely. He saw a truth so profound and dangerous that it threatened to unravel everything he had built his brutal career upon. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, lowering their weapons slightly. The confidence they had in their leader was visibly shaken. They had seen Kane face down hardened outlaws without flinching, yet the words of this lone warrior had stopped him cold. Tano finished speaking, and a heavy silence descended upon the ranch yard once more. He looked directly at Kane, his eyes holding not fear, but a quiet, commanding authority. It was the gaze of a man who held a power far greater than any firearm. Ilara, watching from the doorway behind him, felt a surge of awe. She did not understand the words, but she felt their weight. In that moment, the wounded man transformed from a victim into a figure of immense strength. "He is Tano," Kane finally managed to say, his voice a choked whisper. "Son of Chief Grey Wolf." He turned to his men, his face ashen. He is the peacemaker. The deputies stared, their confusion turning to shock. This was the man who had brokered the treaty with Fort Reliance, the man who had ended 3 years of bloody warfare. He was a hero to some, a symbol of hope. "He is wanted for the murder of Colonel Warren," Kane added, his voice regaining some of its old authority. "Treaty or no treaty, he will hang for killing a soldier." It was a desperate attempt to regain control, but the seed of doubt had already been planted in the minds of his men. They were no longer sure who the real criminal was. "Colonel Warren was my friend," Tano said, his English clear and precise, cutting through the tension. "He was killed by men who wore the paint of my people, but they were not my people." He looked from one deputy to the next, his gaze earnest. "He was killed to break the peace, to start the war again." Ilara listened, her heart aching with the injustice of it. She had heard whispers in town of men who profited from conflict, who sold firearms to renegade bands, and grew rich on bloodshed. It had seemed like a distant evil, but now it was here, standing on her porch, threatening to consume them all. She believed Tano, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul. Colonel Warren discovered their plan. Tano continued, his voice steady despite his pain. He found proof of a conspiracy. Officials taking bribes, gunrunners arming those who refused peace. He was killed before he could expose them. His hand went to a small leather pouch at his belt, but not before he gave this to me. He held up a blood-stained folded letter. "It contains the truth. It contains names, including the name of a man in the territorial marshal's office." All eyes turned to Kane. The marshal's face was a mask of fury and desperation. He saw his power, his wealth, his very life slipping through his fingers. The hunter had become the hunted, and the proof of his guilt was in his quarry's hand. The deputies shifted uncomfortably. They were simple men, lawmen who followed orders. But they were not fools. They remembered the strange commands. The shipments of rifles that went missing. The patrols that were inexplicably redirected. Things that had not made sense at the time now clicked into place, forming a dark and damning picture. Ilara stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Tano's arm to steady him. It was a small gesture, but it was a declaration. She stood with him. Her faith in him was a silent challenge to the armed men before them. Kane saw the gesture and his eyes narrowed with hatred. His authority was crumbling, and this girl's quiet defiance was another crack in the foundation. A young deputy named Finn, his face etched with conflict, took a half-step forward. "Marshal," he began, his voice hesitant but clear. "I remember that shipment of repeaters bound for the fort. You told us it was taken by raiders, but we never found a trail. Not a single track." Another deputy nodded in agreement. "And what about those patrols near Blackstone Ridge? You sent us west, but the attack came from the east, just as the colonel warned it might." The questions were respectful, but the challenge was unmistakable. Kane's men were no longer blindly following. They were thinking, remembering, and the sum of their memories was a tally of his betrayal. Kane's face darkened with rage. "Fools!" Kane snarled, his voice cracking with desperation. "Are you going to believe the lies of this savage over the word of your commanding officer? He is a murderer, a silver-tongued devil trying to save his own skin." But his words rang hollow. The evidence of his own corruption was too strong, reinforced by the quiet dignity of the man he was trying to condemn. Tano had masterfully turned Kane's own men against him without lifting a weapon, using only the undeniable power of the truth. He had exposed the rot at the heart of their command, and now the structure was collapsing. Ilara watched, her admiration for his courage growing with every passing second. He fought not with bullets, but with honor. Kane saw the wavering loyalty in his men's eyes and knew he was lost. The letter in Tano's hand was a death warrant, and his deputies were no longer willing to be his executioners. His mask of civility finally shattered, revealing the desperate animal beneath. With a roar of fury, he drew his revolver, the metallic sound echoing in the tense silence. "If you will not do your duty, I will do it myself," he screamed, his face contorted in a mask of hate. I will silence him for good. The situation had reached a deadly impasse. Justice was no longer the goal, survival was. And Cain was determined to survive, even if it meant spilling more innocent blood on Elijah Stone's land. The world seemed to slow down. Elora saw the dark opening of the revolver's barrel, the madness in Cain's eyes, the sudden, sharp intake of her father's breath. This was the moment where everything would be decided, in a flash of smoke and fire. The psychological tension became a physical weight, pressing down on all of them. Each person in the yard was trapped in a web of choices made long ago, choices that had all led to this single, terrible point in time. There was no escape, no turning back. The trigger would be pulled, and the lives of everyone present would be forever altered by the sound of the gunshot that was sure to follow in the heavy, waiting air. As Cain's finger tightened on the trigger, a new sound cut through the air. "No, Marshal." It was Deputy Finn. He had drawn his own firearm and now stood between Cain and Tano, his face pale but resolute. "There will be no more killing today." For a moment, Cain stared at him in disbelief, his mind unable to process the betrayal. Then, one by one, 4 other deputies raised their weapons, not at Tano, but at their commander. Only a grizzled veteran named Hawkins remained loyal to Cain, his own firearm now aimed at Finn. A tense, deadly triangle formed in the ranch yard. 6 armed men, all pointing their weapons at each other, each convinced they were in the right. "You are making a grave mistake, Finn," Cain hissed, his voice low and venomous. "This is mutiny. I will see every one of you stripped of your badge and thrown in a cell." Finn did not waver. "I have made enough mistakes following your orders, sir. I will not make another." The air crackled with unspoken threats. This was how range wars began, how good men died for bad reasons, with honor and duty twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Elora held her breath, her hand gripping Tano's arm. She could feel the tremors of pain and exhaustion running through him, but he stood tall, a silent witness to the implosion of the authority that had sought to destroy him. The standoff was a delicate balance of terror. Each man calculated his chances, eyed his target, and waited for the first move. A bead of sweat trickled down Cain's temple. He was a bully and a coward, accustomed to wielding power, not having it turned against him. The fear in his eyes was mingled with a burning rage. He had been so close to silencing the one man who could expose him, so close to securing his fortune and his position. Now it was all slipping away, held at bay by the very men he had commanded, the men he had viewed as little more than tools for his own corrupt ambitions. The sun beat down, indifferent to the life and death drama unfolding below. Elijah slowly raised his rifle, the movement calm and deliberate. He did not aim at anyone in particular, but his message was clear. There would be no bloodshed on his land if he could help it. "Marshal," he said, his voice a low rumble, "it seems your authority here has ended. I suggest you and your man stand down." The tension became unbearable. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. A twitch of a finger, a nervous glance, a sudden noise could set it off, resulting in a meaningless bloody melee that would solve nothing and cost everything. Each man was a prisoner of his own conviction, standing on a knife's edge between a fragile peace and a violent, bloody end. Into this deadly silence, a new sound emerged. It was not a gunshot, but a song. Tano, his voice low and haunting, began to sing in the language of the Blackfoot. The melody seemed to rise from the earth itself, ancient and filled with a sorrowful power. The words spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of brothers standing together against a great darkness. It was a sound that did not belong in a standoff with firearms and angry men, yet it had an immediate and mystical effect on everyone present. The deputies lowered their weapons slightly, their faces filled with a strange wonder. They did not understand the words, but they felt their spiritual weight, a call to a higher purpose than simple violence. Even Cain seemed mesmerized for a moment, his rage faltering in the face of the haunting sound. The song was a lament, a prayer, and a declaration all at once. It changed the very air in the yard, washing away some of the anger and fear, replacing it with a profound sense of solemnity. Alara felt tears well in her eyes. The music was beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to a spirit that could not be broken by pain or injustice. It was the song of a proud people facing extinction, a final, defiant cry of their enduring honor. She saw Tano not as a man from a different race, but as a kindred soul, expressing a deep and universal truth through his voice. But Elijah, with his long years of experience on the frontier, recognized the song for what it was. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Tano was not just singing a ceremonial dirge. He was calling to his people. The melody was a signal, a message carried on the evening wind to ears that knew how to listen, a summons for aid that was far more powerful than any gunshot. The song was a warning that the white man's justice had failed, and that the Blackfoot would now seek their own. Elijah knew that this confrontation was about to escalate in a way he could not have imagined. The arrival of a few lawmen would soon become a meeting of two nations. As the last note of the song faded into the twilight, a new sound replaced it. It was faint at first, a distant rumbling, like the sound of faraway thunder, but it grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable drumming of many hoofbeats. A great number of riders were approaching, and they were approaching fast. Cain and his men heard it too, and a new kind of fear entered their eyes. They had come to hunt one man, but now it seemed they had drawn the attention of his entire tribe. The crisis had just reached a new, far more dangerous level. The small drama at the Lone Pine Ranch was about to become the stage for a much larger conflict, one that could ignite the entire territory. Over the horizon they came, not as a chaotic mob, but in a perfect, disciplined formation. 50 Blackfoot warriors, their faces grim, their war paint gleaming in the dying sunlight. They moved with a silent, deadly grace, a vision from another world. At their head rode an elderly chief, his gray hair braided with eagle feathers, his posture radiating a dignity that commanded respect from 100 yards away. This was Gray Wolf, a man who had never bowed to anyone. The warriors approached not for battle, but in a ceremonial formation, their weapons remaining sheathed. It was a display of power, not an act of aggression. They had come to witness, not to fight. Marshal Cain's face was a mask of pure terror. He was surrounded, his authority gone, his life hanging by a thread. "Shoot them!" he shrieked at Hawkins. "They are savages, open fire!" But even Hawkins hesitated, his loyalty finally broken by the sight of the assembled warriors and the sheer folly of his commander's order. The chief dismounted and walked slowly toward his son. He embraced Tano, a rare display of emotion that spoke volumes. Then his eyes, sharp and intelligent, settled on Cain. At the same time, Deputy Finn cleared his throat. "Marshal," he said, holding up a new telegram. "A rider just brought this. New orders from the territorial governor. All pursuit of Tano is suspended." Cain stared at the telegram as if it were a snake. His world was collapsing around him. The governor's order meant that someone with more power than him already knew about the conspiracy. The chief then produced a leather satchel. From it, he pulled a stack of papers and handed them to Finn. "The rest of Colonel Warren's evidence," Gray Wolf said, his voice deep and resonant. "His correspondence with the gun runners. Detailed records of every payment, every shipment." Finn began to read, his eyes widening with each line. The proof was overwhelming, a meticulous account of Cain's treason that would send him to the gallows a dozen times over. The law had finally caught up to the lawman. Alara watched this incredible scene unfold. The quiet ranch had become the center of a historic moment. The courage of her father, her own small act of compassion, had led to this. It had brought a dark conspiracy into the light and had averted a war. She looked at Tano, now standing beside his father, his wound forgotten in the gravity of the moment. Their eyes met across the yard, and a silent understanding passed between them. A connection had been forged in the crucible of that afternoon, a bond of mutual respect and admiration that felt stronger and more real than anything she had ever known. It was a fragile seed of hope, planted in the hard, unforgiving soil of the West. Faced with absolute ruin, Marshal Cain made one final, desperate move. With a wild cry, he lunged for his firearm, which lay on the ground, and aimed it not at his deputies, but at the unarmed Chief Gray Wolf. It was a madman's gambit, an attempt to sow chaos and perhaps escape in the confusion. In that split second, before anyone else could react, the wounded Tano threw himself in front of his father. It was an act of supreme courage, a son shielding his chief, without any thought for his own life or his grievous injury. The 50 warriors on the hill reached for their bows and lances in perfect, deadly unison. The fragile peace was about to shatter. But before Cain could fire, a second figure moved. Elijah Stone, with a speed that defied his age, tackled the corrupt marshal from behind. The two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The shot went wild, the bullet kicking up dust harmlessly. The immediate danger had passed. The Blackfoot warriors held their positions, their weapons ready but not yet released, their discipline holding firm as they awaited a command from their chief. Deputy Finn and his men swarmed over Cain, quickly subduing him and wrenching the revolver from his grasp. Hawkins, seeing it was over, dropped his own firearm and raised his hands in surrender. The crisis was averted not by one hero, but by the brave actions of many. A native warrior, a white rancher, and a group of disillusioned lawmen had worked together, their shared sense of justice overcoming the hatred and greed that had driven Silas Cain. The conspiracy was broken, and its architects were now prisoners. As Finn secured Cain and Hawkins in irons, the Blackfoot warriors slowly lowered their weapons. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the crowd. The war that had been moments away from erupting had been stopped. A new, more profound understanding had been forged in the heat of the confrontation. Tano sagged against his father, his strength finally giving out. Ilara rushed to his side, her medical supplies in hand. As she tended to his reopened wound, her touch was gentle and sure. "You are so brave," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He looked up at her, his face etched with pain, but his eyes clear and full of a deep, unspoken feeling. "Bravery is easy when you are protecting what you love," he replied softly. In the quiet aftermath of the violence, their shared glance was a promise, a recognition that their lives were now intertwined in a way that neither of them could have foreseen when the day began. In the calm that followed, Chief Gray Wolf performed a sacred ceremony. He stood before Elijah, placing his hands on the rancher's shoulders. He spoke words in the Blackfoot tongue, his voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition. Tano, standing beside them, translated for Elijah and Ilara. "My father says you have the heart of a warrior and the spirit of a brother. You risked your life for a stranger, for truth. You chose compassion over fear. For this, our people will forever call you friend." The chief's words were a profound honor, a bridge being built between two very different worlds, founded on mutual respect. The 50 warriors dismounted and formed a silent, respectful circle around Elijah. One by one, they stepped forward, each man touching his hand or shoulder in a gesture of kinship. It was a recognition that transcended race and culture, an acceptance of the man not for his skin, but for the content of his character. Elijah, a man of few words, was deeply moved, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He had lived a simple, solitary life, and he had never expected such an honor. He had simply done what he felt was right, and it had changed the course of history for the entire territory. As a final gesture, the chief presented Elijah with a sacred war lance. It was a beautiful object, decorated with intricate beadwork and the feathers of a golden eagle. "This belonged to my grandfather," Tano translated. "It has never been carried by anyone not born of the Blackfoot. It is now yours, a symbol of the peace you helped to save." Elijah accepted the gift with reverence. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of trust, a sacred bond between two peoples. He knew he would treasure it for the rest of his days, a reminder of the day that violence was defeated by courage and understanding. As the warriors prepared to depart with the recovering Tano, he paused before Ilara. "You have a healer's spirit," he said, his voice soft, "and a warrior's courage. I will not forget what you did." Ilara felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "And I will not forget you," she replied, her voice equally quiet. No further words were needed. A promise had been made, a future hinted at. As he rode away with his people, Both of them knew it was not a final goodbye. A new chapter had begun for them, and for the land itself, a chapter that would be built on the foundations of brotherhood and honor. Years passed. The trial of Silas Cain and his conspirators was swift, the evidence irrefutable. They were convicted of treason and conspiracy. Their reign of terror brought to a decisive end. The peace treaty, once fragile, was expanded and strengthened, with new clauses ensuring fair trade and mutual respect. The Lone Pine Ranch, once a place of violent confrontation, became a symbol of this new era. Elijah Stone, the quiet rancher, became a respected mediator, his counsel sought by settlers and natives alike. His wisdom, like his courage, was simple and profound. He treated all men as equals, a lesson learned beside his well on a hot summer day. Deputy Finn, true to his word, became the new territorial marshal. He rooted out the last vestiges of Cain's corruption, building a force of lawmen known for their integrity and fairness. He often visited the Lone Pine Ranch, seeking Elijah's advice and enjoying the quiet peace of the place. He never forgot the lesson he learned that day, that the law must serve justice, and justice knows no color or creed. He became a force for good, ensuring that the dark days of Cain's rule would never return. The territory began to prosper under his watchful eye, with settlements growing and tensions easing. Tano, after his recovery, returned to his people. When his father, Gray Wolf, passed into the spirit world, he was chosen to be the new chief. He led with the wisdom he had learned from his father and the compassion he had seen in Elijah and Alara. He guided his people into the new era, embracing education and trade while fiercely protecting their traditions and their land. He became known as Tano the Wise, a leader who had seen the worst of men and had chosen to believe in the best. His friendship with Elijah and Marshal Finn became the bedrock of a lasting peace that blessed the entire region for decades. And Alara, who had offered water to a wounded stranger, found her destiny intertwined with his. Tano returned to the ranch often, and their bond deepened with each visit, growing from mutual respect into a profound and abiding love. They married a year after the standoff, their union, a powerful symbol of the new peace. They raised their children on the Lone Pine Ranch, teaching them the traditions of both their peoples. Their family was a living bridge between two cultures, a testament to the idea that love and compassion could triumph over hatred and fear, creating a better, more hopeful world for all.